Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author and screenwriter and also director of the Centre. And today I am joined by one of our tutors who is also an author and expert on all things Welsh. And so the theme of our podcast today is Wales. So I'm going to attempt a greeting in Welsh. Apologies to any Welsh listeners. Shimai shydach chi?
Dwi'n iawn, diolch, a shydach chi, which is, I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
So Claire Fayers has written a number of books for younger people, as well as more recently a collection of Welsh myths and legends. So Claire, do you want to tell us first of all about your journey to being a writer? Because what you're doing is what many of us writers end up doing. You do your original fiction, but sometimes you also do these sort of collections and other things for publishers. So do you want to explain how you got to be where you are today?
Yes, well, it was a very long and tortuous route, I think, with lots of detours through Mirkwoods and down in big holes and clambering back out again. But I have always loved stories. And right from a child, I read voraciously and made things up in my head all the time. I think I found it was just an escape from everyday life. And the worlds I created in my head was something that I had control over. And as a child, you have very little control over your own life. And I think I loved that sense of actually being in charge of something. So I would spend ages making things up and then making my characters do things and then thinking, oh, what if they did something else, and then go for something else. So I think as a child, I was naturally pointed in that direction. Although as a child, it never occurred to me that this was something that I could do.
Yeah, I don't know if you were like me. I used to look at a shelf of books in the library and just assume everyone was dead who wrote it.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know why. They're all dead, you know.
Well, they were all rich men with beards and pipes and fancy jackets, and they were certainly weren't. They were no sort of girls from South Wales. It was all very posh people. And I'm thinking, yeah, people like me. I thought, yeah, it didn't even occur to me that it was something that I could do until I left university, and I went through a period of unemployment, was just wanting something to fill the time, and saw a course on freelance writing and marketing. I thought, oh, I might as well have a go. And so I got started actually writing for magazines, got the first things published, and it was just such a thrill to actually have something in print that it took off from there.
Wonderful. So I was reading the introduction to your book of Welsh legends, and you have a very telling phrase about wherever you tread, you're stepping on stories. So we'd like to expand on that a little, because I think this is something that inspires a lot of fantasy writers, that though we're creating other worlds like Tolkien, what we're really walking through is a sort of idealized version of our own world. So, you know, Middle Earth is full of bits of Oxfordshire and Yorkshire and the Alps and places like that where he walked. So would you want to say how that works in terms of myths and legends?
Yes, I think in terms of Wales has got this great tradition of myths and legends, and it's always something I didn't actually know much about when I started writing. I was just writing the kinds of stories I wanted to tell, the sort of things that I had in my head. And then gradually, as people started identifying me as a Welsh writer, I started feeling more Welsh, I think, because of that. I'm looking into the Welsh stories. So many of them are actually tied to the landscape, which is something I absolutely love about them. Your standard European fairy tales, a lot of them could just happen in a wood or in a castle or some sort of generic town. In Welsh ones, it's that river over by there has got a monster in it, and the monster is called the Avanc, and if you go close to the river, it will leap out and eat you. Or that mountain is where the devil used to play cards with Giant Jack. And so much of it is specific to the locations. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these fragments of folk tales as well, with odd bits of the devil pops up all over the place in Wales, we seemed to like him as a sort of trickster character. And he was forever frightening people who didn't go to chapel and that kind of thing. And the lakes will have the fairy folk and monsters, and there were dragons in the mountains. Almost every place you can find an associated legend with it. It's as if people just looked around where they were and thought, oh, I wonder what that could be. And just drawing inspiration from the landscape to tell stories, which then gained a life of their own.
Yeah, I think perhaps actually if we did but know that some of the ones you mentioned are generic, like a forest or whatever, probably do have a similar origin. Because I was struck a couple of years ago, I was visiting my sister in Cyprus, and they were friendly with local Cypriots. And one of them, George, was telling me a story, and it went something like, oh yeah, and that beach down there was where Aphrodite landed from her shell ship, and she walked up to this spring up here, and such happened. So even something like the Greek gods and those myths and legends to modern day Cypriots still have a real
local resonance. Yes, I think some of the better known stories and the ones that have travelled everywhere maybe almost become generic because each storyteller will put them into whatever their own location is, or just say a forest far away.
I think perhaps the Odyssey is a bit of an exception in that, because a lot of the monsters are connected with dangerous places for sailing. So it's a bit like a navigation aid. Don't go near this Scylla and Charybdis, because your ship will wreck. It seems quite sensible warnings. And I also think that we do, I don't know about you in your own family, but I think we create stories too, even now. It hasn't obviously reached the level of myths and legends passed over to other people, but car journeys, for example, that you would do regularly when we had small children, we would tell stories about things that you saw en route. We had a particular one. If you go down to the southwest in this country, there's a sort of wicker man who points the way. He looks a bit dilapidated these days. And so we started telling stories about the tubby man of the southwest, because he's got a bit of a beer belly, and linked him up to the Angel of the North, which is a very fine Anthony Gormley statue up in Newcastle, that area. And every time we passed it, we'd have a new story about this creature, and just because it's a landmark. And I felt that was tapping into that urge to tell stories, pass the time, entertain the children, and which I'm sure is where a lot of these myths and legends come from.
I think they do, and a lot of the modern urban myths of the I think Terry Pratchett, in at least one of his books, and probably more, says that they are the notion that these stories keep happening.
Yeah.
Almost like there are certain things in the story that resonates. There is the girl in the car whose boyfriend gets out, and then she hears a thump thump and realizes that somebody is banging his severed head on the roof.
Oh yeah, the horror stories.
Those sort of horror ones. They sort of, nobody knows where they came from or who originally came up with them.
I think, so going back to Wales, I think there are a couple of recurring characters. This is not the Mabinogion level of storytelling. I'm talking more about the fairy tale level. That I feel particularly Welsh. There's a particular Welsh kind of dragon, I think. And there's also the creatures in the mines. I know places that have mines, Poland, up north around here. I'm sure Germany, anywhere that has mines have their little creatures in the mines, but there are also little creatures in the mines in Wales. Do you want to sort of perhaps tell us a little bit about those two groups?
So yeah, the dragons, obviously there is a very famous story of why the Welsh flag has got the dragon on it, and the notion that they were two dragons who were fighting. It actually does date back to the Mabinogi. In the Mabinogi, there is one story in which the red dragon and the white dragon are causing chaos, and they are basically given a load of mead to drink. And when they're thoroughly drunk, they cart them off and stick them in a cave. And then later on, it's Vortigern, king of the Britons, just after Roman times, is trying to build a fortress there. and he doesn't know that there's the cave in the hill with the dragons, and the fortress just keeps falling down all the time. And they find out that they've got the 2 dragons they're fighting, and the idea is that the red dragon represents the sort of plucky Welsh people, and the white dragon is the invading Saxons at the time. And of course, the Welsh flag was not it was not chosen as a symbol because of that story, but it was also like later on when people said, "Oh, why is there a dragon?" These sorts of fragments of stories came up, and now you've got this whole legend about why there is. And yeah, the tappers in the mines. I've got that the pucca, they call them in Wales. You've got them in Cornwall as well. And as you said, anywhere you've got mines, there will be strange noises in the mines and echoes of sound. And yes, people came up with the notion that there are people there, and in the Welsh mines, often they would tap to either warn you of danger or to show you where the best seams of coal, gold, whatever it was they were mining would be. And so you could sort of follow the sound to find a new rich seam or something.
So are Welsh dragons, going back to the dragon theme, are they largely threat figures, or are they sometimes a sort of funny, benign? So Tolkien, for example, in Farmer Jars of Ham, his dragon, this is obviously a modern, relatively modern story, turns out to be quite friendly, whereas Smaug is not. So is there a range of dragon types in Welsh stories?
I think not so much. I think generally the dragons are pretty indifferent to the fact that there are people. It's almost like dragons are like the original inhabitants back when Wales was just full of magic before the humans moved in, and they were dragons and they were monsters, and they were the Tylwyth Teg, the fair folk. And they are largely indifferent to people coming along as long as we don't get in their way and annoy them.
I think it is fun to see generations of these things, because I remember growing up, you look about similar vintage to me, there was a fantastic animation on TV called Ivor the Engine.
Oh gosh, with the dragon doing the engine, yes.
So the dragons, I think the eggs are hatched in the steam, the coal, the furnace bit of the steam engine, firebox or whatever it's called. Don't write in, please, if you're a steam engine expert. I will look it up at some point. That was extremely sweet and cozy. So that's my impression of
really nice, friendly little dragons. Yes, there are. Yeah, there aren't so many stories that have them, surprisingly, despite the fact that we have one on the flag. And they do tend to be that they are just creatures that are from almost from another world, and our lives don't really interact with them that much.
I have flag envy, I think. So if Scotland, for example, does go independent in the next decade or whatever, and they have to rethink the Union Jack, I really think there's a huge case for bringing the Welsh dragon right in the centre. Let's rebrand. If Wales hasn't gone independent as well, let's rebrand. That'd be great. We could have a white dragon and a red dragon. That would be just
good. Actually, have the 2 fighting on the flag. That would be really good.
Well, hopefully not fighting.
Or just facing off against each other on the flag. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so there we go. Flag makers out there. That's my tip. So, is there any other sort of favourite Welsh folk tales that have particularly interested or intrigued you outside these dragon and tapper tales?
Well, you have the Mabinogion, of course, and this year I was lucky to be invited to actually write a story for the new collection called The Mab, which Matt Brown and Eloise edited, where we each, basically 11 different children's authors, we each took a story and rewrote it with children in mind, which was I had one which was a story which was a bit of a non-story about a man who had a dream. So I had to construct a narrative, but then other people had the really bloodthirsty ones, and I'm trying to make them suitable for younger readers was fun. But the thing I've really become interested in is the little bits. I've discovered quite a few Victorian gentlemen who used to travel around Wales, and they would just look at people when they stopped in a place and ask for the stories, ask people to sort of talk to them, tell them about the things they knew, and recorded them. And you've got just lots of little detail, and it's all based around the local areas and the local people then. And it's stuff that doesn't tend to get told.
That seems as though they're following in the footsteps of the Brothers Grimm, who I think perhaps one of the early, well, I suppose it started with the ballad collectors like Percy, ballad collections in the 18th century. If anyone studied 18th century literature, there's these ballads that somebody called Percy collected, which has some fantastic, lots of Scots stories in there and others. Because ballads were one of the original ways, obviously, of transmitting stories. I'm sure you know that.
Yeah, it is very much so, and very much in the same tradition. The people who became interested in Welsh folklore and legends, and just travelled around and collected a load and published them.
Do you sense a Victorian gentleman's editorial hand on them, or have they managed to keep the flavour?
Depending on the collections, they are different, because you have some which were written by sort of American people. There's a I am actually trying to remember the man's name now, possibly William Griffiths or something. But he was Welsh heritage. I think his grandparents had emigrated to America and he came back over, ended up in Cardiff for a while and started collecting the folklore. And you get some of the English Victorian gentlemen very much, we will now talk to the peasants and see what the peasants will tell us. And there's very much a sort of these are the rough superstitious folk who are telling us their things. But there is a Welsh reverend and school inspector whose his essay is, I've mentioned him in the introduction to the Welsh fairy tales, I think, and he compiled an essay that was the prize winner at the Eisteddfod in the 1 year. And whenever he went around to do the school's work, he would ask to be pointed towards the oldest people in the place, and he would just sit and chat to them. And he wrote down all sorts of things. And that there is no condescension or no sense of sort of I'm collecting these curious tales in that. This is just one person talking to another and writing down what they say. And that was a really wonderful collection.
So the Eisteddfod, just for people who aren't familiar with it, is a cultural festival that happens once a year in a Welsh. It moves, doesn't it? It moves from town to town, and it has choirs and. Well, you tell us what it has.
Yes, it has a bit of everything. It's a real celebration of music, poetry, storytelling, writing. They have some poetry competitions where they will give the poets a theme and then send them away for half hour, and they come back and read out what they've written in that time, and that kind of thing.
I've been once. I went when actually my daughter, my eldest child, was 6 weeks old, and I was carrying her in a sling because she was tiny, and I never had so many people come up to me speaking in Welsh, because I think they thought I'd come to sort of baptize her in.
Oh, of course.
I don't actually have any Welsh ancestry that I'm aware of. I wish I did, but yeah, it was a wonderful event. So Claire, looking at all of this, and it's one of the great sort of bodies of stories that we've inherited. What do you think has carried over into our modern fantasy writing? Have you seen any, I suppose particularly the Mabinogion, that must be stories from that which are percolating through the rock strata and becoming out into different
things? Yeah, so I mean the most famous Mabinogion example, of course, is Alan Garner's The L Service, which obviously is old itself now, but very Welsh, set in a Welsh valley, where the notion is that this story pattern just keeps happening over and over in different iterations, in different generations.
I think we should congratulate Alan Garner at this point for appearing on the Booker long list.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, another person who one might think is no longer writing for whatever reason, and there he pops up. Wonderful.
He just keeps going. He is quite amazing. And yes, and I think apart from that, there are things that people might not actually be aware were Welsh in origin. Like notion of, I mean, the Talk with Teg come up. You get that a lot in in the sort of rural folklore type thing, the notion that there are fairy folk, magical folk who look human, and sometimes they will help, sometimes they're malevolent. Again, they sort of live in a different reality from us again. So sometimes our paths cross with them, and sometimes we come off better for it, and sometimes it can be very harmful. It's that notion of you're never quite sure where you are with magic.
And of course, the whole Arthurian links are huge. I mean, we're talking about the Celtic world of storytelling, of course.
Yes.
There's a lot of shared and cross-fertilization. But Wales is full of places associated with King Arthur. And of course, Merlin. Wasn't Merlin supposed to be Welsh in some versions of the story?
Merlin is, yes, Myrddin. He is. There's a Welsh. And of course, you've got the Welsh poet Taliesin, who was almost like an early type of Merlin.
For those of you on your Inklings watch, Taliesin is the main character in the cycle of Arthurian poems written by Charles Williams, who's one of the Inklings. So there we are. I'm joining the dots here.
Nice link there, yes.
Do you think there are untapped seams to mine, if we carry on our mining metaphor here, stories that you've thought, oh, this is new, this is different, this has been forgotten?
I think there are loads, and I think it is a case of digging below the things that are known, the Mabinogion and the stories of dragons and King Arthur and so on, and actually delving into these small bits of folklore and seeing what we can bring out of them, because some of them are almost not even stories, it's just fragments of bits. It's like the tappers in the mine. There are the story in my book. I had that was probably the one I had the most trouble with, because it's not really an actual story that goes with it. There is just a notion that there are fairy folk in the mines who will tap, and I had to come up with something to go with it. But there are instances of that could just provide great inspiration. There's actually a rock up in the hill where I live now. I moved house during lockdown, and I'm just outside Abergavenny now. And close to where I live, there's a standing stone. It was just left over from the quarry. When they closed the quarry, they stuck it there as a thing to say, oh, we were here once. There's now a story around it that it was a farmer who was so cruel that his wife drowned herself in the River Usk, which is the one that runs just by the village. And he got turned to stone as a punishment. And every Midsummer's Eve, he will turn back into a person again and wander along the riverbank calling for his wife, who has got the good sense never to reply, probably. And then he returns to stone. And that's why the stone is there. And that one has quite fascinated me, because at some point, somebody, although knowing that it's just a stone from the quarry, came up with this whole thing, which has then become a bit of a local legend. I mean, things like that. I mean, standing stones are a great source of inspiration, of course.
And I suppose in a few generations, the fact there was a quarry there, that part may be forgotten, because that's everyday and less interesting, and people latch on to suicide, husband and wife turning to stone. I mean, it's much more exciting, isn't it?
It's a much more interesting story.
Yeah. So we've touched on this a little, but in fact, what you've just spoke to has really illustrated this, that folklore hasn't stopped, that we're carrying on adding to it. Would you say that it retains in Wales a national flavour, something about being Welsh, or is it become more of a sort of human condition, universal story?
I like to think that there is a different national flavour, and the same as there's a particular flavour for English and Scottish and Irish folklore. But of course, some of it is just, as the populations become more mobile and you get far more of a mix of people in different places, then I think the stories become more universal in a way.
Yeah, I think there's probably two pools there. So in England, you wouldn't really say English, you'd say Cornish, Yorkshire, Northeast. You know, you'd make it quite
true. It would be regional.
The place we live in. So for me, I'm living in Oxfordshire, so it's the kind of world of Wind in the Willows and, you know, Tolkien. It's that kind of rural hobbit stuff around here. So our most recent folklore is probably now known as great literature, which is just the sort of like Wind in the Willows is a story about the Thames River down there. Somebody went and sat on the bank and said, hey, you know, there was a mole. So we've got a lot of projections of our local environment that then ends up on the world stage. But I've got this feeling there's lots of things happening all around the place. Like David Almond is great at stories about his world up in near Newcastle. I'm not sure what's happening in Cornwall. I've got to think about that, but other than Poldark, but we're not talking Poldark.
There must be something, yes.
Yeah, it's just me not having thought long enough about it. So what do you think are the lessons for us as writers, thinking about our own original work rather than as collectors of stories?
I think let your environment inspire you.
Yeah.
Because your relationship with your immediate surroundings is something that's unique to you. And so if that percolates through into the writing, it's going to give a flavour to your writing that is all yours and that nobody else can replicate. So be on the lookout for local stories and things. But also when you're walking around, look at the stone on the hill and think, oh, I wonder where that came from. Or the funny shaped tree or what have you. And just make a habit of making up stories.
I think I like the specificity of it as well. Difficult word to say. And I noticed this, it was one of the things that I absolutely adore about Tolkien is that it's not just a general tree, it's an oak or an elder or a elm, and they sit down beside a particular kind of river. So it's not just they sat at the banks of the river, you know, it's got a willow tree that with roots going in a certain way. And that sort of moving out of the general fog of description to something where you feel you're there, I think is a real art to make fantasy land as convincingly real.
Yes, and seeing the landscape through the eyes of your characters. So almost as we as narrators, we'll be seeing the things through our own eyes and trying to convey that. But of course, your characters are not you.
Yes.
They might have aspects of you in them, but your characters are their own individual people. So to think about how your characters are actually going to see the landscape, what they will notice, the stories that might come into their heads as they look around at things, can be a real way of showing the connection between your character and the world that they're in, and then bringing both of them to life more.
Yeah, and it's also that little one of those tips for show don't tell, you know. So if you want to introduce their idea of their religion or something, or the way they believe the world was made, you can do it through them looking at a stone cairn or you know, the hill over which the sun rises. I don't know, whatever, it depends.
Or something that's significant to them. Yes.
Yeah.
And find the things that your character will care about in the world and pay attention to. Indeed.
So Claire, it's wonderful that you've recently joined the team of tutors for the Oxford Centre for Fantasy, and you're an experienced teacher of creative writing. Are any of these worlds of myths and legends things which you find useful to bring into that teaching practice?
Yes, I use them a lot, actually. I do a lot of creative writing classes in schools, and this year a lot of it has been focused on Welsh folktales. And so whenever I go to a different school, I will try and look up something that is local to that school that I can tell them, and then get the kids to write a sequel to it, or use it as a spring-off point for coming up with their own ideas. So I will show photographs, I will tell whatever stories I can find, and just use that as inspiration.
I think the very local aspect of that is really key, because, you know, going back to where we started about looking at a library and not seeing a Welsh lady's writing up there. But if you actually say, look, these are stories about what happens outside your door. I've got a version of that which is not connected with myths and legends. I always talk about how you are the expert. As a younger person very hard to feel the expert on anything because teachers tell you how much you don't know.
Yes.
Whereas that corner of the neighborhood, that tree you swing on and make and climb, you are the absolute expert on that. That's your tree, your backyard. That's your, if you want to claim somewhere for a story, that
is true. Yes, and I find that children become. I know as a child, I would become very excited if I ever saw anything that sort of reminded me of my sort of home area, which didn't happen much in books. But the kids become so excited to find out that there are stories about their area, about their local rivers, and that they've got their own stories that are worth listening to.
And I think also for adults, when you're teaching adults, connecting back to that time in childhood when you perhaps, hopefully not treated like an indoor cat, but you're allowed to roam a little bit.
Yes.
If you remember the way you interacted with your local area, those memories bring back that acuity of perception, don't they? It's I can remember the rough ground on the sort of out the back of our house where I grew up in Essex, which probably adults will look at and think, oh, that's rough ground, spoil of some sort of building project. The children looked at it and we thought, that's our den. That's the den of the rival group over there. And we've got to hide here because it was near a golf course. Got to hide here if we see any golfers. It became an area of adventure, and just thinking of those feelings and how you knew everything. We tell stories about what other people had done there, accusing others of doing all sorts of nefarious things. It's just ripe with story, a tiny little patch of land.
It is that sense, I think, that you said that it's an area where there are stories, and there's a real physicality to interacting with your environment as a child, that you're clambering over things, you're feeling everything, you fall down, you graze your knees, you get back up again, which an adult might, you said, just walk across that rough patch of ground without paying it any attention. But there's this real physical interaction with the place, and the whole wealth of storytelling that the children do when they're playing. And it's yes, as an adult writer, trying to tap back into that and bring that excitement back, that your world is one where adventures can happen, and there's something special about your environment that other people don't notice.
So if people are listening to this and wanting a sort of a little writing exercise, I think having a go at remembering somewhere like that, because I'm sure it will open doors and you'll find yourself recalling so much, because memories have a way of hooking other memories onto them.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, so it would be a good thing to have a go at. So I've been talking about you as a collector of stories, but we did also mention that you've written your own fiction books for children. Do you want to tell us something about them and the directions you've gone in as a writer?
Okay, well, the first book, I'm holding it up here, and nobody can see it because this is a podcast.
No, there will be a visual version of this as well.
Oh, okay, right.
But I think
the book it's The Accidental Pirate's Voyage to the Magical North was my first one, which I actually did as a NaNoWriMo book, the National Novel Writing Month, which happens in November every year. And I sat down and just wrote it for fun. Wrote down a list of everything that I liked to read about, or I thought would be fun to put into a story. So there was pirates, magic, sea monsters, sword fighting, swing elf, chandeliers, the whole lot. And penguins, because I like penguins. And I just challenged myself to see if I could put it all into a book, which I finally did. And I eventually entered it for a writing competition and won that, and got the publishing contract for 3 books through that.
What was the competition? Does it still run, in case people are...
Yes, the competition is called Undiscovered Voices, which is run by Scooby, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. It's open to everyone in the UK and Europe currently, I believe, and happens every other year. It is you basically submit your first 4,000 words and the synopsis, and the winners are put together in an anthology, which is sent around all publishing houses and agents. So the year I entered, one of the judges was an agent. She contacted me straight away and she said, "Oh, I really liked your opening." I think, "Gosh, did you?" I was like the most surprised person in the world. So I eventually, signed with her, and then got the contract with Macmillan.
So those of you listening in the States, there's also a Scooby, SCBWI, if you're Googling it, in the States as well, which may do something similar. I suspect it does.
I suspect it does. They do have a lot of competitions and help for new writers. So if you're writing for children, I would definitely recommend having a look at it. That's a very good. Yes, it's a great organisation. Yes, but I think there has been a big theme. I mean, my second one is Journey to Dragon Island, so you can guess what appears in that book.
Can you what's that title again? Say that again.
Yeah, the next one, Journey to Dragon Island, is number 2.
Is it still with pirates?
It is. It's still got the pirates. It's got the same pirate crew, but they're off to the type of film that I liked watching as a child, where the special effects were by Ray Harryhausen and everything would blow up, and they would be. So I tried to come up with my own original twist on all of the tropes of going to some sort of magical pirate island and exploring it and finding the various things there that will, traps and monsters and things that they have to deal with. So that they were a lot of fun to write, and there is a big theme of storytelling in them. The first one is all about how legends start and the types of stories people tell. My evil magician is not at all happy that he's been cast as the villain in all of the stories. And they do point out to him, well, if he doesn't want to be the villain, maybe he could stop acting like one.
Top tip, that one.
And so, and I wasn't thinking about myself being Welsh at all in those books, to be honest. I was just writing what was in my head.
And that actually, what you've just said is important, because we're passing through a phase now of huge, focus on identity, which is obviously a reaction to the lack of representation and diversity in literature. Back to the days of the white men with beards, as you started saying. But it also, there is a pressure now on people to somehow speak for a group. So I'm speaking for the Welsh. I'm speaking for women born in Essex, for me. Having to swim upstream from the Towie, the only way is Essex influence here. For those of you in the States listening to this, there's a particular program, reality TV program, which has set the sort of image of people from the place I came from. So I'm trying to suggest they're not all like that. But we end up sort of carrying the can, and mine is less obvious. But if you're somebody from a different ethnic background or gender, all that stuff, sometimes it's just nice just to write as yourself and not feel I've got to be.
Yes, that is true. Yes, rather than feeling that you're representing the whole group, because to some extent you can represent the group, as in you sort of, if you identify with a particular thing. I mean, I now very much identify with being Welsh, but I'm still me, and me being Welsh is very different from somebody down the road who's also Welsh, or somebody up north who's Welsh. We have very different experiences of living in the country. There's actually a very interesting book of essays that came out this year called Welsh Plural. To anybody wanting to look at Welsh culture and writing, they've got some great. It's a mixture of about 25 different writers just writing about their experiences of living in the country and how they perceive themselves.
So we always end, coming to the end. I suppose I've gone back to near where we started. We always end with deciding where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something. And because one of the unique things about Wales is its history of mining, slate mining, coal mining, gold mining. Under the Romans, I think gold mines, weren't there?
Yeah.
So I thought we'd have where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to be a miner?
Miner, wow,
I'm not talking about
definitely,
a young
yeah.
person, but as in someone who digs things out of mines. There's lots of rubbish places to be a miner.
Yes, and yes, you do not want to be a miner in Moria, really.
No.
Waiting for the Balrog to come. Yeah, after a lot of thought, there's one book that came to mind. It's a modern fantasy series by Patrick Samphire, based around a character called Mennick Thorne, who is a not terribly good mage. It's sort of like the Dresden Files, but set in a high fantasy setting. And the city where he lives, the city of Agathos, is built on the remains of dead gods, and the body parts of the dead gods are literally still there and contain huge amounts of magical power. So if you're a miner in Agathos, you never know what you're going to be pulling up. You could be sort of digging around and suddenly come across some sort of fingernail of a god that will make you the most powerful person in the city. So I think that would be, yes, a bit dangerous, but rather interesting.
So can you repeat the name of that book again?
Yes, so the series is called, it's the Mennick Thorne series by Patrick Samphire. The first book in the series is Shadow of a Dead God.
That sounds
yes, and the notion is that, yes, there are bits of dead gods littering the landscape.
Yes, when I set this question, I immediately thought of all the bad places to be a miner, because you're often sent there as punishment for crimes. It seems in fantasies, particularly modern, like sci-fi fantasy, mining planets where you get sent as punishment is quite a common trope.
Yeah.
So I decided the only place I could think where it was at all a pleasant lifestyle was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Disney version, where it's just full of jewels. They're just there, they're just there. Anything, and you go home.
Yes.
So that's
if they do it. Yes.
So that was where I would pick. I'd smuggle myself in amongst the dwarves. Yeah. So thank you so much, Claire, for telling us about that. We will put a link to your books in the show notes for people if they want to expand their knowledge of Welsh myths and legends, or pick up the Accidental Pirates, they'll be able to find them. And so thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr.